I rise today in support of H.R. 4404, the Terrorist and Foreign Fighter Travel Exercise Act. This legislation the efforts that I and several of my colleagues on the House Homeland Security Committee have been engaged in for much of the 114th Congress as members of the bipartisan task force on combating terrorist and foreign fighter travel. For 6 months, our task force investigated our security vulnerabilities and the threat posed by ISIS. Our work produced 32 key findings and over 50 recommendations to make Americans safer. In our findings, the task force found that the growing complexity and changing nature of the foreign fighter phenomenon may be creating unseen gaps in our defenses, yet it has been years since any large-scale stress test has been conducted on U.S. government protection and prevention programs against terrorist travel. The last major government exercise on terrorist travel occurred in 2009, when the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, conducted an exercise focused on the aftermath of a notional terrorist event outside of the United States and how to prevent subsequent efforts by the terrorists to enter the United States and carry out additional attacks. The objective of that exercise was to determine how government agencies at all levels would respond in such an environment. However, the threat environment in 2016 has changed considerably, and relying on information gathered during an exercise that took place 7 years ago is simply unacceptable and puts American lives at risk. The exercise conducted in 2009 also focused primarily on terrorists attempting to infiltrate the United States from overseas. However, our task force found that officials today should be just as concerned about Americans leaving the country to train overseas with terrorist groups as foreign fighters. The ability of these hardened fighters to then return to the United States is a legitimate security threat to the homeland. Catching individuals who are looking to join the ranks and train with ISIS and other terrorist organizations prior to their initial departure is equally important, and it should be a goal of law enforcement as well. As such, H.R. 4404 would require that the Obama administration conduct an exercise to evaluate the nation's preparedness against all phases of foreign fighter planning and travel. Carrying out such a test would be beneficial in understanding how partners at all levels of government and abroad are currently responding to these scenarios. The feeble response to ISIS by this administration is irresponsible, and we must take decisive action to defeat this threat that they and other terrorist organizations pose to us. The findings of this exercise, required by this legislation, will identify weaknesses at home and abroad that might be exploited by terrorists and foreign fighters, particularly to infiltrate the United States to conduct attacks. These findings will also be provided to Congress and federal law enforcement and intelligence officials and provide information on how we can best address these weaknesses. I am pleased that over the last several months, the House has passed numerous pieces of legislation that were products of this bipartisan task force work, including some recommendations that are now law. Passage of the Terrorist and Foreign Fighter Travel Exercise Act today represents continued action by this body to fight against ISIS and ensure we keep America safe. I want to thank Chairman McCall and Ranking Member Thompson for establishing this task force on combating terrorist and foreign fighter travel. I'd also like to thank Chairman of the task force, Congressman John Katko, for his leadership, and the other members who served on the task force for their continued dedication to seeing our recommendations through. I look forward to the implementation of many more of the task force findings, and I urge all members to join me in supporting this common-sense bipartisan bill. Before I close, I ask unanimous consent to include in the record an exchange of letters between Chairman of the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure and the Chairman of the Committee on Homeland Security.
Without objection.
I urge all members to join me in supporting this bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The lady reserves. The chair